Chapter 9, Bodily-Kinesthetic Intelligence. Our hero Bip hauls his suitcase onto the platform, climbs aboard the train, locates a seat, and then, with considerable strain, shoves his heavy suitcase onto the overhead rack. As the train gathers speed, Bip is tossed about on his seat even as his precariously rested suitcase is thrown out of the overhead rack. Bip manages to catch it and then carefully replaces it upon the shelf. The conductor arrives to gather his ticket. Bip goes through his pockets and, with increasing frustration, turns them inside out, as all the while the moving train continues to toss him about. When he still cannot find his ticket, his search becomes frantic, and he goes through all the compartments of his suitcase. Next, our hero takes lunch out of his suitcase. He unscrews the cap of his thermos bottle, lifts the cork, and pours coffee from the open thermos into the cup, which has earlier served as the cap of the bottle. But due to the sway of the train, the coffee being poured from the mouth of the thermos never reaches the cup. Instead, the liquid flows in a straight line downward to where the cup was but no longer is. The hapless Bip eventually falls asleep. As the train slows down and comes to a rather abrupt halt, Bip is rudely awakened, apparently jolted by the cessation of the train's movement. This little set of events could be a scene spied upon a train, or more likely a comic skit enacted upon a stage or in a movie house. In actuality, however, it is a mime performance by the great French artist Marcel Marceau, as described by psychologist Marianne Simmel. As Simmel points out, Marceau seems on a superficial level merely to be doing what real individuals do all the time. But he's so funny when he does it. In fact, however, the representation of actors, objects, events, and actions in the absence of the actual physical props amounts to a considerable departure from daily activities. It is up to the mime to create the appearance of an object, a person, or an action. And this task requires artful caricature, an exaggeration of movements and reactions, if the components are to be unambiguously recognized and stitched together into a seamless performance. To depict an object, for example, the mime has to delimit, by means of gestures, the shape of an object, and to denote, by means of facial expressions and bodily actions, what that object is doing and its effects upon him. An especially talented mime like Marceau is able to create not only personalities, like a bully, and actions, like climbing, but also animals, butterflies, natural phenomena, waves cresting, and even abstract concepts such as freedom or bondage, good or evil, ugliness or beauty. More amazingly still, he often creates a number of these illusions simultaneously. The mime is a performer, and an exceedingly rare one indeed. The intelligences upon which he draws are not widely developed in our culture, yet perhaps for that very reason he indicates in particularly striking form the actions and capacities associated with a highly evolved bodily kinesthetic, or for short, bodily intelligence. Characteristic of such an intelligence is the ability to use one's body in highly differentiated and skilled ways, for expressive as well as goal-directed purposes. These we see as Marceau pretends to run, climb, or prop up a heavy suitcase. Characteristic as well is the capacity to work skillfully with objects, both those that involve the fine motor movements of one's fingers and hands, and those that exploit gross motor movements of the body. Again, these can be observed in a Marceau performance, as he delicately unscrews the cap of the thermos or lurches from side to side in the hurtling train. In this chapter, I treat these two capacities, control of one's bodily motions and capacity to handle objects skillfully, as the cores of bodily intelligence. As I have noted in the case of other intelligences, it is possible for these two core elements to exist separately. But in the typical case, skill in the use of the body for functional or expressive purposes tends to go hand in hand with skill in the manipulation of objects. Given these core components, I will focus on those individuals, like dancers and swimmers, who develop keen mastery over the motions of their bodies, as well as those individuals, like artisans, ball players, and instrumentalists, who are able to manipulate objects with finesse, but I will also consider other individuals in whom use of the body proves central, such as inventors or actors. It is important to stress that in these latter occupations, other intelligences ordinarily play an important role. For instance, in the case of the actor or the performer, skill in personal intelligences and also in many cases in musical or linguistic intelligence, is part and parcel of successful performance. Nearly all cultural roles exploit more than one intelligence. At the same time, no performance can come about simply through the exercise of a single intelligence. In fact, even Marcel Marceau's capacity to use his body with such precision may well involve contributions from several intellectual domains. Skilled use of one's body has been important in the history of the species for thousands, if not millions, of years. In speaking of masterful use of the body, it is natural to think of the Greeks, and there is a sense in which this form of intelligence reached its apogee in the West during the classical era. The Greeks revered the beauty of the human form and, by means of their artistic and athletic activities, sought to develop a body that was perfectly proportioned and graceful in movement, balance, and tone. More generally, they sought a harmony between mind and body, with the mind trained to use the body properly and the body trained to respond to the expressive powers of the mind. But intelligent use of the body can be discerned in other pursuits as well. Turning his attention to physical combat, the novelist Norman Mailer indicates, "There are languages other than words, languages of symbol and languages of nature. There are languages of the body, and prize fighting is one of them. A prize fighter speaks with a command of the body which is as detached, subtle, and comprehensive in its intelligence as any exercise of the mind. He expresses himself with wit, style, and an aesthetic flair for surprise when he boxes with his body. Boxing is a dialogue between bodies. It is a rapid debate between two sets of intelligences. A description of use of the body as a form of intelligence may at first jar. There has been a radical disjunction in our recent cultural tradition between the activities of reasoning on the one hand and the activities of the manifestly physical part of our nature, as epitomized by our bodies, on the other. This divorce between the mental and the physical has not infrequently been coupled with the notion that what we do with our bodies is somehow less privileged, less special, than those problem-solving routines carried out chiefly through the use of language, logic, or some other relatively abstract symbolic system. This sharp distinction between the reflective and the active is not, however, drawn in many other cultures. This fact should at least give us pause before we conclude that a particular legacy of Western, Cartesian thought is a universal imperative. It is also worthy of note that psychologists in recent years have discerned and stressed a close link between the use of the body and the deployment of other cognitive powers. There is a discernible tendency to focus on the cognitive facets as well as the neuropsychological basis of skilled body use, and a clear trend to analogize thought processes with sheer physical skills. The insightful British psychologist Sir Frederick Bartlett drew an analogy among various kinds of skills where diverse receptive and performing functions were linked. The player in a quick ball game, the operator, engaged at his workbench, directing his machine and using his tools, the surgeon conducting an operation, the physician arriving at a clinical decision. In all these instances, and in innumerable other ones that could just as well be used, there is the continuing flow from signals occurring outside the performer and interpreted by him to actions carried out. Then on to further signals and more action, up to the culminating point of the achievement of the task, or whatever part of the task is the immediate objective. Skilled performance must all the time submit to receptor control, and must be initiated and directed by the signals which the performer must pick up from his environment in combination with other signals internal to his own body, which tell him about his own movements as he makes them. According to Bartlett's analysis, all skilled performances include a well-honed sense of timing, where each bit of a sequence fits into the stream in an exquisitely placed and elegant way, points of repose or shift, where one phase of the behavior is at an end and some calibration is necessary before the second one comes into play, a sense of direction, a clear goal to which the sequence has been heading, and a point of no return, where further input of signals no longer produces a result because the final phase of the sequence has already been activated. Bartlett goes beyond the sheer analysis of bodily skill in his intriguing claim that much of what we ordinarily call thinking, routine as well as innovative, partakes of the same principles that have been uncovered in overtly physical manifestations of skill. From related analyses by other psychologists, we can identify other staples of highly skilled performance. Over the years, the highly skilled performer has evolved a family of procedures for translating intention into action. Knowledge of what is coming next allows that overall smoothness of performance that is virtually the hallmark of expertise. The periods of hovering or halting, which call for keen attention to environmental factors, alternate with periods of seamless fluency, where numerous component parts fall readily into place. Programming of actions at a relatively abstract level allows the choice of those particular units of performance that will result in the smoothest possible sequence of activity. It is just because of this mastery of the possible alternatives, the ability to enact the sequence most effective for present purposes, that the expert looks as though he has all the time in the world to do what he wants. As I have noted, bodily use can itself be differentiated into a variety of forms. Like Marcel Marceau, one may use one's whole body to represent a certain kind of activity, for example running or falling, chiefly for expressive ends. In a sport like football or boxing, one tends to use one's whole body or grosser motor actions. Of equal, if not greater, importance in human activity is the elaboration of fine motor movements, the ability to use one's hands and fingers to carry out delicate movements involving precise control. The act of grasping a small object precisely with opposed thumb and finger, which prosimians cannot execute at all, and which higher primates can do with only modest skill, has been carried to an exquisitely and qualitatively higher level by human beings. A good pianist can produce independent patterns of movement in each hand, sustain different rhythms in each hand, while also using the two hands together to speak to one another, or to produce a fugal effect. In typing or in shooting, a finger can be moved for just a few milliseconds, or an eye just a few degrees, in order to allow precise attacks or adjustments. And in dance, even the tiniest quiver of a finger may assume importance. As Suzanne Farrell, master ballerina of the New York City Ballet, has declared, "In a performance, when I look and see my little finger out there, I say to myself, that's for Mr. B," the noted choreographer George Balanchine. Maybe nobody in the audience notices it, but he's seen it and appreciates it. While studies of perception and language have dominated published treatments in neuropsychology, the saga of the brain's role in physical activity proves to be as intriguing as reports about the aphasias, or as accounts of the detection of edges, lines, colors, and objects. And indeed, even as bodily intelligence may have been taken for granted or minimized in importance by many researchers, motor activity has been considered as a less high cortical function than functions subserving pure thought. Yet, as Roger Sperry, the doyen of American neuropsychologists, has shrewdly pointed out, one should look upon mental activity as a means to the end of executing actions. Rather than motor activity as a subsidiary form designed to satisfy the demands of the higher centers, one should instead conceptualize cerebration as a means of bringing into motor behavior additional refinement, increased direction toward distant, future goals, and greater overall adaptiveness and survival value. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that most segments of the body and the nervous system participate in one or another way in the execution of motor actions. The various agonist and antagonist muscles, joints, and tendons are involved in the most direct ways. Our kinesthetic sense, which monitors the activity of these regions, allows us to judge the timing, force, and extent of our movements, and to make necessary adjustments in the wake of this information. Within the nervous system, large portions of the cerebral cortex, as well as the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum, all feed information to the spinal cord, the way station en route to the execution of action. Paradoxically, whereas the cortex serves as the highest center in most forms of human activity, it is the relatively lowly basal ganglia and the cerebellum that contain the most abstract and complex forms of representation of movements. The motor cortex is more directly tied to the spinal cord and the actual execution of specific muscular movements. For my purposes, it is not necessary to review the mass of information that has been secured about the physical operation of the bodily kinesthetic systems in human beings, but it is germane to call attention to some general principles that have emerged. To begin with, the operation of the movement system is tremendously complex, calling upon the coordination of a dizzying variety of neural and muscular components in a highly differentiated and integrated fashion. For example, in the movement of the hand, to retrieve an element or to throw or catch an object, there's extremely intricate interaction between the eye and the hand, with the feedback from each particular movement allowing more precisely governed subsequent motion. Feedback mechanisms are highly articulated, so that motor movements are subjected to continuous refinement and regulation on the basis of a comparison of the intended goal state and the actual position of the limbs or body parts at a particular moment in time. In fact, voluntary movements require perpetual comparison of intended actions with the effects actually achieved. There is a continuous feedback of signals from the performance of movements, and this feedback is compared with the visual or the linguistic image that is directing the activity. By the same token, the individual's perception of the world is itself affected by the status of his motor activities. Information concerning the position and status of the body itself regulates the way in which subsequent perception of the world takes place. In fact, in the absence of such feedback from motor activity, perception cannot develop in a normal way. Much voluntary motor activity thus features the subtle interaction between perceptual and motor systems. At least some activity, however, proceeds at so rapid a clip that feedback from perceptual or kinesthetic systems cannot be used. Particularly in the case of overlearned, automatic, highly skilled, or involuntary activities, the whole sequence may be pre-programmed so that it can unfold as a seamless unit with only the slightest modifications possible in light of information from the sensory systems. Only such highly programmed sequences will allow activities of the pianist, the typist, or the athlete, each of whom depends upon lengthy sequences of movement that unfold at great speed. Manfred Clynes, a neuroscientist interested in musical performance, points out, one may decide to move a finger a distance corresponding to 1 inch or 2 inches, or to turn the eyes to look at an object, say, 20 degrees or 30 degrees to the left. In each case, the muscles start, complete, and stop the motion in a fraction of a second. The movement is pre-programmed by the brain before it begins. Once such a short movement has begun, the decision is merely executed. Within that fraction of a second it takes to execute, there is no feedback that can permit one to modify the programmed decision. Moreover, some of these motor programs may not need to be developed. Many motor programs are part of a primate's genetic endowment. No sensory feedback or spinal reflex loops are necessary for learning the repertoire of movements. Perceptual and motor systems are no doubt in part set by the shaping effect of some aspects of the environment, but the systems that emerge seem to be highly specialized, intrinsically programmed in quite different ways. In short, what is taken for granted without direct evidence in the case of physical growth, on the basis of an implicit argument from poverty of the stimulus, is also being found in the study of the brain and the nervous system. While much of the operation of the motor system occurs in similar fashion throughout the primate order, at least one dimension of human motor activity, and perhaps the most important, seems restricted to our species. That is the capacity for dominance, the potential for one half of the body and one half of the brain to assume the ascendancy across a range of motor and perceptual activities. There are traces of brain laterality in higher primates. As baboons learn to carry out activities with a high degree of finesse, one limb will tend to become dominant, playing the leading role in both gross and delicate movements, while the other assumes a supporting role. Moreover, this division of labor will be reflected after brain damage, where the supporting hand becomes unable to carry out what were formerly executive roles. But there are apparently no tendencies in baboons or other primates for one specific side of the brain, and the contralateral body side, to become generally dominant. The tendency for left hemisphere dominance in motor activity seems to be a proclivity of human beings, no doubt at least partially under genetic control, and one that in all likelihood is linked to language. Just as most normal individuals will have their language capacities housed in the left hemisphere, so too will the left halves of their brains be dominant for motor activity. And, again supporting the genetic argument, left-handedness or right-brainness for motor activities seems to run in families. Buttressing my claim for a separate bodily intelligence, it turns out that injuries to those zones of the left hemisphere that are dominant for motor activity can produce selective impairment. Neurologists speak of the apraxias, a set of related disorders in which an individual who is physically capable of carrying out a set of motor sequences and cognitively capable of understanding a request to do so is nonetheless unable to carry them out in the proper order or in a proper manner. Some apraxias of great specificity have been described. For instance, there are cases of isolated dressing apraxia, impairment in putting on a suit of clothes. More commonly, individuals exhibit limb kinetic apraxia, where they cannot carry out a command with either hand. Ideomotor apraxia, where they clumsily execute actions and use the body part itself as an object. For example, when pretending to pound a nail, they will ram a fist against a surface rather than represent the absent implement in their grip. Or ideational apraxia, where individuals exhibit a special difficulty in running through a sequence of actions smoothly and in the correct order. It is of some interest that these various lapses, an inappropriate execution or an omitted action, are also found in normal individuals, particularly when they are operating under pressure. While these apraxias often occur in conjunction with aphasia, there is considerable evidence that apraxia is not simply a linguistic or a symbolic disorder. Individuals who fail to carry out commands can understand what is called for, even as individuals with severe linguistic comprehension disorders exhibit amazing preservation of the ability to execute certain kinds of command. For example, those involving the movement of the whole torso. Moreover, a number of studies have confirmed that the degree of impairment in understanding various symbols does not correlate highly with the ability to carry out voluntary motor actions. Finally, several researchers have documented that individuals who have completely lost their verbal memories nonetheless remain capable of learning and remembering complex motor sequences and patterns of behavior, even when they vehemently deny that they ever have encountered the sequence in question. All of which adds up to a picture of bodily intelligence as a realm discrete from linguistic, logical, and other so-called higher forms of intellect. There are even occasional patients, otherwise normal, who can carry out virtually no actions at all. These are the isolated apraxics who exhibit, in essentially pure form, an absence of bodily intelligence. Can intelligence of the body be spared in isolated form as well? Certainly, there are neuropsychological patients whose linguistic and logical capacities have been devastated, but who show little or no difficulty in carrying out highly skilled motor activities. These patients have not been much studied, perhaps because this symptomatic picture is, to the Western mind, much less surprising than the contrasting capacity to speak or reason in the absence of motor skills. While selective preservation of motor activities has not been much commented upon, one form of preservation related to bodily intelligence is remarkable. Some exceptional youngsters, such as idiot savants or autistic children, may be totally cut off from their fellows yet show a preserved interest in and knowledge of bodily activities and mechanical devices. In order to evince these forms of understanding, it is probably essential to have preserved bodily and spatial knowledge. The idiot savant literature includes the cases of Earl, who on his own figured out how to make a windmill out of a clock, of Mr. A, who was able to wire his stereo, lights, and television to a single switch, and of another similarly impaired youth who designed and built a functional merry-go-round. The clinical psychologist Bernard Rimland relates the story of an autistic youth named Joe, who draws on theories of electronics to build devices. He recently put together a tape recorder, fluorescent light, and a small transistor radio with some other components so that music from the tape was changed to light energy in the light and then back to music in the radio. By passing his hand between the recorder and the light, he could stop the music. He understands the concepts of electronics, astronomy, music, navigation, and mechanics. He knows how things work and is familiar with technical terms. By the age of 12, he could find his way all over the city on his bike with a map and compass. He reads Bowditch on navigation. Joe is supposed to have an IQ of 80. He does assembly work in a Goodwill store. Perhaps the most famous case of this type is Joey, the mechanical boy, described some years ago by psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim. According to Bettelheim's report, Joey was an otherwise hapless autistic youngster who displayed a special interest in machines. Not only did he like to play with machines, taking them apart, putting them together, manipulating all manner of screws, wires, cords, but most phenomenally, young Joey liked to pretend that he was a machine. Indeed, his reality was one of machines. As Bettelheim describes it, During Joey's first weeks with us, we watched absorbedly, for example, as he entered the dining room. Laying down an imaginary wire, he connected himself with his source of electrical energy. Then he strung the wire from an imaginary outlet to the dining room table to insulate himself, and then plugged himself in. He had tried to use real wire, but this we could not allow. These imaginary electrical connections he had to establish before he could eat, because only the current ran his ingestive apparatus. He performed the ritual with such skill that one had to look twice to be sure there was neither wire nor outlet nor plug. His pantomime was so skilled and his concentration so contagious that those who watched him seemed to suspend their own existence and become observers of another reality. By virtue of his pathetic story, happily Joey eventually improved. This youngster demonstrates that the ability to enact and mime can exist despite a profound communicative deficit. He also underscores the link that I have imputed between the capacity to use one's body in highly skilled ways and the understanding of machinery, for, as suggested, Joey possessed considerable understanding of the nature and operation of a variety of machines, particularly ones that feature whirling motion and climactic destruction. Here, bodily intelligence may well be supplemented by spatial and logical mathematical forms of understanding. How might refined bodily and mechanical intelligence come about? One set of clues derives from a study of the evolution of cognitive skills. There is essentially no flexible tool use found in animals below the primate order. That is, lower organisms do not use different objects flexibly for the purpose of manipulating the environment. Rather, there is a tendency for each species to use one or two tools in a highly stereotypical way, with only the appendages of the body, claws, teeth, beaks, used in an instrumental fashion. Even in the lower primate orders, tool use is infrequent and not particularly generative or innovative. Often, objects are thrown around during periods of great excitement, but they are not directed toward any utilitarian ends. They are, in fact, simply random components of loud and aggressive displays whose purpose is to intimidate others. Yet evolutionary sources document that higher primates have been using simple tools for several million years, and that chimpanzees can achieve some impressive results. A much-studied and highly suggestive example of sophisticated primate tool use is termite fishing in chimpanzees. As described by Geza Telecki, this is an activity in which the chimpanzee first uses a finger or a thumb to scrape away a thin layer of soil covering the entrance to a tunnel. Then pokes an object into the mouth of the tunnel, pauses while holding the end of the object in one hand, extracts the object with its attached termites, and then picks off the desired termites with lips and teeth while holding the probe in one hand and stabilizing the free end on the other wrist. Such termite fishing is by no means an easy task. Initially, the chimpanzee must find a tunnel. That one is not easy to find as confirmed by Telecki, who himself engaged in weeks of futile searching for a tunnel until he finally opened one inadvertently. Next, the chimpanzee must select a tool for probing. Again, it may try a number of twigs, vines, or grass stalks before selecting an appropriate probe, and, if necessary, modifying it. Modification can consist of trimming away leaves or other projections, or breaking or biting the probe down to suitable size. Telecki found that despite months of observation and imitation, he could never reach the proficiency of a young chimp. In his own view, selection proficiency is a learned skill which must, like tunnel locating, entail a considerable amount of trial and error behavior backed by long-term retention of the results. The retention span may actually cover the lifetime of an individual. In the fishing stage, the chimpanzee must insert the probe to the right depth, 8 to 16 centimeters, with appropriate turns of the wrists so that the probe can navigate the curves of the tunnel. Then the probe must be gently vibrated with the fingers, enough so that the termites will bite onto the probe, but not so much that they will bite right through it. Once they are hooked on, the probe can be extracted from the tunnel, but not too rapidly or clumsily lest the termites be scraped off by the tunnel wall. Termite fishing is performed differently across diverse chimpanzee groups. Because these groups are close genetically, it is likely that the contrasting practices reflect different social customs. For example, one population uses probes to fish inside the mound, so its probes are relatively short and thin. A second group uses the probe to perforate the mound surface, and so its probes must be relatively strong and rigid. Other cultural differences involve the kind of material selected for the probes, whether the tools are obtained near or far from the mound, whether one or both ends of the probe are used, and whether the chimpanzees use a power or a precision grip on the tool. W.C. McGrew has described the acquisition of the skills for termite fishing in the Gombe chimpanzee population in Tanzania. According to his account, infants under the age of 2 will exhibit all elements of the technique in rudimentary form. They will eat termites, poke on the mound's surface, modify raw materials, and the like. Between 2 and 4 years of age, the young chimps spend considerable time climbing about termite mounds, poking into mounds or holes, and snatching their mother's tools. Their sequential integration gradually improves over the period. By the age of 4, some individuals may exhibit the polished adult form of the behavior, but still will not persist in long feeding bouts. This latter capacity develops by the age of 5 or 6. As I have noted, it is important for the young primate to sustain a relationship with an adult figure throughout such a learning process. The young chimpanzee or monkey observes and gains knowledge about the process from seeing others engage in it. By contrast, primates raised with surrogate parents exhibit a different approach to problem solving. While wild monkeys view the situation as a problem where some solution is possible, surrogate-raised monkeys behave as if they lack any consistent strategy or plan. Only naturally reared monkeys apparently understand that their behavior has an effect on the environment, and that they can, to some extent, control events. Lack of efficacious models results in learned helplessness. More generally, primates are much more likely to learn use of a tool if they are situated, and play, in proximity to other individuals that are already able to accomplish desirable goals. Primates are much more likely to emit a behavior if they have observed a conspecific carry it out, if a reward, like food, has been obtained, or if the primate just happens to imitate the response and finds that it leads to a desired outcome. Authorities speculate that at least 3 sets of factors determine whether a primate will be able to learn to use a tool. First of all, there is sensory motor maturation, necessary for skill and precision of muscle movement. Second, there is play with environmental objects in casual or problem-solving settings. During play, for example, the chimpanzee learns to use a stick as a functional extension of its arm. Finally, there is response-contingent stimulation, which teaches the young organism that its own behavior can, at least to some extent, control the environment. Evolution of human beings over the past 3 or 4 million years can be described in terms of the increasingly sophisticated use of tools. 2 to 3 million years ago, the tool use by Homo habilis represented only a modest advance over what primates had been doing for millions of years before. The basic toolkit at this time consisted of rounded stones that were used to bash objects, and rough stones used for chopping. At this time, prehistoric humans began to use stones to bash crude flakes from a pebble. The bashing of stones against one another, with force being transmitted through such object contact, produced stone tools like scrapers with a sharp edge that could be used for cutting. Such tools represented a genuine innovation, for early hominids could use these sharp edges to chop hides and to butcher a carcass. Such choppers and flakes constituted the basis of tool-making until about 1.5 million years ago, when large bifaces or hand axes began to appear. The wielder was Homo erectus, who employed these axes for finer, more powerful, and more accurate kinds of cutting and splitting. Over the next million years, possibly until 40 or 50,000 years ago, changes in tool use proceeded slowly and gradually. Presumably, the procedures for making tools were passed on through visual observation and gestural imitation, with only slight changes occurring from one generation to another. Perhaps 1/2 million years ago, men began to hammer stone in order to make finer implements. 200,000 years ago, during the Acheulean period, there was soft hammering of bone for flaking and retouching. And 100,000 years ago, during the Levallois period, there was the first striking of flakes from a prepared core stone, followed by working or touching up the flakes. During this 1 million year period, other changes were taking place in humans, as reflected in the steadily increasing size of the brain. Fire came under hominid control. There was collective and brutal big-game hunting, including the massacre of large herds of elephants. And individuals erected settlements, including not only hearths, but also houses and sitting and working areas. Still, men were probably communicating through gesture and possibly simple vocalizations of an emotional sort. By 100,000 years ago, Neanderthal man, fully human in physique, had appeared in Europe. This powerful and robust individual engaged in running and much combat, as witnessed by the large number of broken bones and healed fractures, presumably received from spear points during close fighting. But there was a tender side to Neanderthal as well. Skulls were placed in niches, individuals were buried, possibly in family plots, and, most poignantly, flowers were placed in the graves. Here we see what may well be the first intimations of symbolic behavior oriented toward specific other individuals. The major explosion in human evolution occurred sometime in the last 50,000 years, probably 35 to 40,000 years ago, at the time of Cro-Magnon man. It is difficult to avoid the speculation that the use of productive oral auditory languages was somehow linked to this explosion, though whether as cause or effect, or both, it is impossible to know. At that time, there emerged clear signs of human symbolic capacities, including pictures, as in the splendid animals and female figures in the Paleolithic caves of southern Europe. Notations, as in the calendrical systems found across Europe and Siberia. And, in all likelihood, the ritualistic dances that are sketched on the walls of many of the caves. There was a correlative revolution in the degree of precision of tools, as bone and stone technology was marshaled with increasing effectiveness. In addition to utilitarian purposes, tools were now used to decorate and, most important, to make other tools. By this time, men had knowledge not only of a wide variety of materials but also of diverse types and classes of tools to be made and used for different purposes, including lances, knives, chisels, needles, and tools for scraping, perforating, whittling, serving, and pounding. The productive cycle between greater brain size, which allowed better planning and more precise use of tools, and the devising of still better tools conferred a decisive adaptive advantage on individuals who could fashion physical tools and, eventually, those abstract and versatile tools called symbols. It is almost irresistible to compare the slow evolution of tool use in primates and in hominids with the analogous, though far more rapid, increase in sophistication found in normal children everywhere. Provided such comparison is done cautiously, it can be informative. Susan Parker suggests that the common ancestor of the great apes and humans apparently exhibited those forms of intelligence, found in children aged 1 to 4, that allow the extraction of food with foraging tools. The descendants of the first hominids displayed a higher level of intelligence, found in children of 4 to 6, and could handle more complex tools, such as missiles for throwing and stone tools to be manufactured, and such tasks as animal butchery, food division, and shelter construction. One can discern a progression, then, from the manipulation of objects, associated with the simple circular reactions of the early sensory-motor period, to the use of tools for the attainment of goals, which reflects the heights of sensory-motor intelligence, to still more sophisticated capacities to use tools that produce non-direct effects on objects, or to design new tools to meet fresh challenges. Such a progression, observable in children, and to some extent in present-day primates, can in part be inferred from the fossil record. And it is in the light of this recurring sequence that authorities speculate about the role of greater overall brain size and newly emerging brain regions in producing the breakthroughs that made our species what it is. One clear difference must be noted, however. Language use begins relatively early in the life of the young child, long before tool use has achieved a sophisticated level. This is the point where divergence from the evolutionary record is most likely, since most authorities see the evolution of language as following a period characterized by considerable sophistication with tools and by the use of gesturing and emotional sounds as the principal means of communication. The prehistoric origins of bodily intelligence and its relation to language and other cognitive functions may forever be wrapped in uncertainty. But the development of these skills in human beings today is a subject on which scientific progress can be made. Though Piaget did not himself view his work in relation to bodily intelligence, he was interested in headier issues. His description of the unfolding of sensory-motor intelligence, in fact, illuminates its initial evolution. One can see in Piaget's description how individuals progress from the simplest reflexes, such as those involved in sucking and looking, to behavioral acts that fall increasingly under the control of environmental variation and individual intentions. One can see formerly isolated events yoked together, such as sucking and looking or looking and reaching, in order to obtain familiar goals. One can see separate acts combined in novel ways in order to achieve fresh goals, earmarks of the height of object permanence. Finally, as the child begins to operate upon mental representations such as symbols, one can note the same sequence of acts and operations recapitulated in a less public arena. Tool use has now invaded the realm of pure thought. A number of students of child development, among them Jerome Bruner and Kurt Fischer, have embraced the idea that the development of skills ought to be conceived of generally, not merely with reference to the bodily activities of infancy, but rather with respect to all manners of cognitive operations. These researchers construe the development of knowledge as a building up of more elaborated and increasingly flexible skills. Smoothed out acts themselves become the subcomponents or constituent acts of ever higher and more complex skills. Thus, for example, the child first combines reaching and looking into grasping. The grasping of single objects evolves into the passing of objects from one hand to the other. The use of sets of objects for daily tasks is transformed into the building of simple structures. Such simple structures become combined into more elaborated displays, and so on. Scholars who pursue the idea of knowledge as skill recognize the increasing internalization of public action into private thought, but insist that every new skill sequence must nonetheless pass through a parallel developmental sequence. In this way, they recall the approach of Frederick Bartlett, who brooked no sharp distinction between physical actions and thinking skills. And they align themselves with contemporary students of human performance, who focus on the development of skills like typing, chess playing, or computer programming, and see each as manifesting increasing mastery of and smoother coordination among various types and levels of skill. There may well be significant continuities between the earliest circular reactions of the infant and the much more elaborated forms of activity that characterize the skilled juggler, typist, chess player, reader, or programmer. Yet the question must be raised whether the acquisition of symbolic competence may, in fact, affect the development of bodily skill in profound ways. When one can state a goal in words, convey instructions verbally, criticize one's own performance, or coach another individual, the methods whereby skills are acquired and combined may take on a different cast. By the same token, mastery of such symbolic functions as representation, denoting an entity like a person or an object, and expression, communicating a mood like gaiety or tragedy, provides individuals with the option of mobilizing bodily capacities in order to communicate diverse messages. Perhaps activities of the body operate to some degree independently of these symbolic functions. The fact that symbolic capacities and motor activities can be dissociated from one another as a consequence of neurological disorders is at least suggestive evidence in this regard. Nonetheless, it is my guess that once human symbolic functioning has become a reality, the motor system becomes forever altered. The flowering of symbolization forges a major chasm between bodily intelligence as it is practiced in humans and bodily intelligence as deployed by other animals. Of all the uses of the body, none has reached greater heights or has been more variably deployed by cultures than the dance. Following the helpful discussion of Judith Hanna, a careful student of this medium, we can define dancing as culturally patterned sequences of nonverbal body movements that are purposeful, intentionally rhythmic, and have aesthetic value in the eyes of those for whom the dancer is performing. Dance goes back many thousands of years, in all probability to Paleolithic times, for masked dancing sorcerers and hunters are depicted in the ancient caves of Europe and in the mountain ranges of South Africa. In fact, of all the human activities depicted in the caves, dancing is the second most prominent, right after hunting, with which it may well have been associated. We do not know all the uses to which dancing has been put, but anthropological evidence suggests at least the following. Dance can reflect and validate social organization. It can serve as a vehicle of secular or religious expression, as a social diversion or recreational activity, as a psychological outlet and release, as a statement of aesthetic values or as an aesthetic value in itself, as a reflection of an economic subsistence pattern or even as an economic activity in itself. Dance can serve an educational purpose. For example, in an initiation rite, by acting out transformations through which an individual will eventually pass. It can be used to embody the supernatural, as when medicine men dance to invoke the spirits. It can even serve for sexual selection in cases where women discriminate among men in terms of their dance performance and endurance. In the Nuba Tira tribe of the Sudan, for instance, young women will throw themselves against the partners they have chosen. And in many cultures, dance serves several of these functions either simultaneously, at different times, or in different contexts. A feeling for some of the diverse uses of dance can be gained by comparing dance among the Hopi Indians of the American Southwest with dance among Samoans in Polynesia. In both cultures, dance is important. The extent of motion is limited, and supernatural powers are involved. However, the aims and the character of the dance differ across these two cultures. Among the Hopi, dance serves to maintain tribal unity, to placate the gods, and to preserve cultural values. Men are the primary performers. For them, dance is a duty, an obligation to the tribe. A good performer is one who remembers the steps, dances energetically, but does not covet individual praise. In contrast, in Polynesia, the dances are personalized, less conservative, and more open to improvisation. Polynesians dance to commemorate events, to entertain, to increase mana, and to propitiate the gods. Both men and women, as well as children, dance. And whether someone becomes a dancer depends upon personal interest, skill, and family tradition. Good performers are those who have individual style and move well. Dance is an area where, in the face of much societal conformity, individualism is tolerated and even encouraged. One might say that among the Hopi, dance serves as a primary area in which the culture's values are expressed, whereas among the Samoans, it provides a kind of counterpoint to the customary rigor of the culture. Given the great variety of purposes that dance can serve, it is difficult to generalize about its canonical form. Sometimes, indeed, the formal features are less important than the surrounding ambiance or the explicit referential content. Nonetheless, certain features do appear to characterize dance in a range of settings, and these prove most germane to a consideration of how skills are embodied in this form of intelligence. According to the American dancer and choreographer Paul Taylor, a dancer must learn to execute a dance movement precisely in shape and time. The dancer is concerned with placement, stage spacing, the quality of a leap, the softness of a foot, whether a movement goes out to an audience or spirals into itself. Many movements are possible, ranging from swaying ones to those that are like a piston, from percussive ones to those that are sustained. It is from the combination of these qualities, varied in speed, direction, distance, intensity, spatial relations, and force, that one can discover or constitute a dance vocabulary. In addition to these relatively objective features, the personality of the dancer will inevitably come across in a performance. Traditionally, dance has dealt with the extreme emotions like joy and grief, but in modern dance it is now customary to attempt to convey more complex emotions like guilt, anguish, or remorse. Though, as George Balanchine once remarked wittily, it is still not possible to depict a mother-in-law in a dance. Music is the most important partner in dance, and the structure of a musical composition will strongly affect the technique in a dance. But inasmuch as dance can also proceed without music, the latter's presence cannot define the dance. So described, dance may seem a dry and relatively abstract form of communication and expression. And indeed, it is difficult to get dancers, or even dance critics, to characterize their activity in a straightforward and concrete way. Pioneer dancer Isadora Duncan summed it up in her well-known remark, "If I could tell you what it is, I would not have danced it." Martha Graham, perhaps the premier modern dancer of the 20th century, made an intriguing observation. I have often remarked on the extreme difficulty of having any kind of conversation with most dancers which has any kind of logical cohesiveness. Their minds just jump around, maybe like my body. The logic, such as it is, occurs on the level of motor activity. Nonetheless, it is typically the concrete and physical aspects of dancing, the use of the body in all kinds of unusual but satisfying ways, that serve initially to attract an individual to the dance. The American dancer and choreographer Jose Limon recalls, as a child in Mexico, I had been fascinated, as any child would be, by Spanish jotas, Mexican charabis, and Indian bailes. Later, across the border, I had seen tap dancers and ballet dancers. Then, pure accident brought me to a performance by the modern dancer, Harold Kreutzberg. I saw the dance as a vision of ineffable power. A man could, with dignity and a towering majesty, dance. Sometimes the sheer properties of one's body serve as seducer. Nijinsky, arguably the greatest dancer of the 20th century, already stood out as a ballet student, displaying a technical virtuosity that was completely out of the ordinary. And sometimes it is the mystery of the patterns that are produced. Amy Greenfield, a contemporary dancer, says that when she attended the ballet as a child, she used to shut her eyes and imagine what would come next. If she opened her eyes and the dancers were where she had imagined them to be, she won. With males in the West, interest in dance may only emerge much later, presumably because of the cultural taboo with respect to men dancing. Nijinsky was teased for being like a girl, thus the taboo was not absent in Tsarist Russia either. Perhaps because of this taboo, the contemporary choreographers Eric Hawkins and Remy Charlip did not even begin to become involved in dance until they were in college. Atavistic forces underlie the creation of dance. Dancer and choreographer Alwyn Nikolai gives an appealing description of how an idea becomes a dance. I prefer to drop a simple, single idea into my brain and let it rummage around for several months, with no particular effort toward consciousness on my part. Then, 2 or 3 weeks before I begin to choreograph, I attempt to cast up the result of this Rorschach process. I like to choreograph swiftly and within a short span of time. I feel that in this outpouring I keep the channels of my subject open. Another artistic performer, Donald McHale, recalls that a childhood memory triggered his first dance. A street, a playground of tenement children, ringing with calls and cries, the happy shouts of the young. Then a large and looming shadow, thrown by a street lamp, the constant specter of fear. Chickie the cop! And the game became a sordid dance of terror. At an extreme, dance becomes sheer pattern. It has been said that just as the ballet master Balanchine cut the bond between dance and narrative, the contemporary choreographer of modern dance Merce Cunningham has cut the knot between music and dance. Cunningham, in fact, is interested in movement pure and simple. He likes to observe insects under microscopes and animals in zoos. He is one of the prime formalists of the dance, an inveterate investigator of how weight and force interact with time and space, a champion of the idea that dance is an independent art that requires no support from music, no visual background, and no plot. His dances therefore provide an opportunity to observe bodily intelligence in its purest form, uncontaminated with representational overlay. But dance can come in many forms. As Mikhail Baryshnikov has commented, dancing is like many new languages, all of which expand one's flexibility and range. The dancer, just like the language scholar, needs as many as possible. There are never enough. While the major training in dance is the disciplined use of the body, other roles that also exploit bodily knowledge require additional or different skills. Ron Jenkins describes the steps through which one passes, and through which he himself passed, in becoming a Balinese clown. First, it is necessary to achieve high technical proficiency in the dance and in the wearing of the masks. These skills are usually handed down directly and personally from generation to generation, with older performers selecting apprentice pupils as young as 6 years old. In learning to be a dancer, one is first grabbed from behind and moved through the proper shapes. In fact, one's limbs are forcibly molded into the canonical stances. Jenkins comments, I was an awkward student, not nearly as supple as the Balinese children who know the movements before studying dance, as a result of watching countless performances since infancy. He was told, don't lift your legs so high, keep your elbows closer to your chest. Next, the newly trained dancer turns his attention to other requirements. He must increase his knowledge of texts, of current events, drama, and of the making and wearing of masks. Beyond these performing prerequisites, the aspiring performer must master personal relationships, getting along with other individuals in the troupe so that they can cast him in a proper and flattering role. Jenkins was ultimately given the role of an old man, in which he could exploit his knowledge of comedy and dramatic timing while minimizing his meager movement technique. And finally, after several months of performing, he was allowed to fashion and dramatize his own stories. In all forms of performance, but particularly in acting, one's ability to observe carefully and then to recreate scenes in detail is at a premium. Such mimetic ability begins very early, perhaps even in the first days or weeks of life. And by the age of 2, every normal child is able to observe scenes or performances by other individuals and recreate on a subsequent occasion at least some of the highlights of the display. It is clear that some children are much better at imitating than others. These born mimics, who are perhaps gifted with a high potential in the area of bodily intelligence, can watch a scene once or twice and pick up the most salient and individuating features, while others who behold the same scene numerous times still prove far less accurate in their recreations. A strong proclivity to imitate and remember displays may be a desirable or even necessary stock in trade for a future performer, but in itself it does not suffice to produce memorable performances. Other intellectual powers are also at a premium. The acting teacher, Richard Boleslavsky, stresses the importance of absolute concentration, where one directs all attention as long as strength endures toward defining the desired object. The actor must try to recreate feelings with the aid of unconscious memory. We have a special memory for feelings which works unconsciously for itself and by itself. It is in every artist. It is that which makes experience an essential part of our life and craft. All we have to know is how to use it. Boleslavsky goes on to counsel, the gift of observation must be cultivated in every part of your body, not only in your sight and memory. Everything registers anatomically somewhere in my brain, and through the practice of recalling and reenacting, I am 10 times as alert as I was. Another master acting teacher, Konstantin Stanislavski, also underscores the crucial role of emotions in the actor's performance. The actor must feel the emotion not merely at the time when he is studying the part, but every time he performs it. Stanislavski sees training as a technique for putting the performer into a creative state where the subconscious can function naturally. In his view, such technique bears the same relation to our subconscious creative nature as grammar does to the composition of poetry. Some musicians have a power to reconstruct sounds inwardly. They play over in their minds an entire symphony they have just heard. Some painters possess the power of inner vision to such a degree that they can paint portraits of people they have seen, but who are no longer alive. Actors have the same kind of power of sight and sound. On the other hand, some acting techniques de-emphasize the need to recreate the felt mood and instead stress attention to surface details. In the terms of this study, an emotion-centered acting technique highlights intrapersonal intelligence, while this latter surface form mobilizes interpersonal intelligence. For many analysts, the ability to watch, observe keenly, imitate, and recreate is central to all performing arts. According to John Martin, a student of performance, we are all equipped with a sixth sense of kinesthesis, the capacity to act gracefully and to apprehend directly the actions or the dynamic abilities of other people or objects. Martin claims that this process occurs automatically. When we pick up an object that we have not lifted before, we draw on muscle memories of lifting objects of similar bulk and density as a natural way of anticipating what our body will have to perform. Past experiences of lifting are symbolized in a kinesthetic language, which is drawn on directly by the body without any other symbolic intervention. By the same token, when we see someone sucking a lemon, we are likely to feel a distinct activity in the mouth and throat as if we were tasting the acid. Or when someone cries, we frequently feel a lump rising in our throats. Martin believes that it is our capacity involuntarily to mimic, to go through the experiences and feelings of others, that allows us to understand and participate in art forms. He declares, "It is the dancer's whole function to lead us into imitating his actions with our faculty for inner mimicry in order that we may experience his feelings. Facts he could tell us, but feelings he cannot convey in any other way than by arousing them in us through sympathetic action." By the same token, in looking at architecture, we decide whether a proportion is acceptable according to whether we feel in our bodies that the mass is supportable by the columns in question, or too heavy for them. The building becomes for the moment a kind of replica of ourselves, and we feel any undue strains as if they were in our bodies. If Martin is right, and imitation is the central component of kinesthetic thought, then imitative teaching and learning may be the most appropriate way to impart skill in this domain. As we have seen, such methods are sometimes used directly, as in the training of Balinese clowns. Cultural anthropologist Ruth Benedict noted that in Japan, in the traditional teaching of writing, the instructor took the child's hand and made the ideographs. It was to give him the feel. The child learned to experience the controlled rhythmic movements before he could recognize the characters, much less write them. The bow, the handling of the chopsticks, shooting an arrow, or tying a pillow on the back in lieu of a baby may all be taught by moving the child's hand and physically placing his body in the correct position. Similarly, at Balinese cockfights, the spectator's hands often mimic the movements of the fight so closely that one can follow the action just by watching the hands in the air. The fact that some individuals prove skilled at this kind of learning, but that it is accorded low priority, may help explain why many promising young performers and dancers in our culture become alienated from school at an early age. If anything, the ability to mimic or imitate faithfully is often considered arrogance or a failure to understand, rather than the exercise of another form of cognition that can be highly adaptive. The interpretation of keen mimetic skill as a failure to understand is, however, not necessarily entirely wrong. A number of comedians who later went on to great success have indicated that their initial impetus for imitating and making fun of the teacher came from genuine difficulties in understanding the lessons they were supposed to be mastering. To be sure, such actors and humorists eventually go on to create full-bodied characters. They do so by filling in superficial outlines of a character, by developing the various situations in which the character customarily finds himself, by touching on the various proclivities, abilities, and deficits of that particular persona, and in its highest realization of all humans. It is through such a process that the great silent clowns of the past, Chaplin, Lloyd, and Keaton, may have passed. And this process may also characterize contemporary masters of humorous characterization, such as Lily Tomlin, Johnny Carson, or Woody Allen. As we encroach on this fascinating and still dimly understood area, it is worth reminding ourselves that humor and jokes are the exclusive property of human beings. While it is certainly possible to make nonverbal jokes and act out humorous scenes without words, there is no convincing evidence that this sensibility is shared with other animals. It is tempting to relate humor in part to the mimetic activity on which it frequently draws. Yet this cannot be the whole story, since other primates are certainly able to imitate behavioral sequences. And in fact, humans often find chimpanzee imitations very funny. Perhaps it is in the perception, rather than the creation, of these mimetic sequences, and in recognizing their deviation from the original model, that a key component of the humor response lies. While other primates are horrified by events that imitate the familiar but are in some way deviant, they do not, so far as we are aware, become amused by such mimicry. Possibly the fact that the previous experience is being commented upon makes it alien to animals other than the human being, sometimes called seriously the laughing animal. The dancer and the actor are but two roles in our culture that highlight the intelligence of the body. Others have also been greatly valued by society. The athlete's ability to excel in grace, power, speed, accuracy, and teamwork not only provides a source of pleasure to the athlete himself, but also serves for countless observers as a means of entertainment, stimulation, and release. According to B. Lowe, an observer of sports, certain features typically characterize the talented baseball pitcher. There is control, the ability to throw the ball just where one wants it. There is craft, the knowledge that comes with experience, analytic power, skillful observation, and resourcefulness. There is poise, the ability to apply craft under great pressure and to produce when the need is most pronounced. And there is stuff. Stuff is the physical element. How hard can he throw? How big is the break on his curve? Stuff is the product of strength and exceptional hair trigger coordination and seems to be an innate quality, perhaps improvable by practice and technique but not acquirable. Obviously, bodily endowment is important in these areas. In baseball, for example, the pitcher should be tall, weigh about 240 pounds, and have the speed of a sprinter. An ideal hitter should be cross-dominant, having the dominant eye on the opposite side of the body from the dominant hand to obtain a view of the pitch unobstructed by his nose. Athletes in other sports also benefit from optimal sizes and physical prowess. Less likely to be a part of one's birthright is a well-developed sense of timing, the sense of coordination and rhythm that leads to well-executed and powerful motions. The champion golfer Jack Nicklaus describes this kinesthetic sense. Feeling the weight of the club head against the tension of the shaft helps me to swing rhythmically. As the backswing progresses, I like to feel that club head's weight pulling my hands and arms back and up. Starting down, I like to feel the weight of the club head lagging back, resisting, as my thrusting legs and hips pull my arms and hands down. When I can wait for these feelings, I am almost certainly swinging in proper tempo. I am giving myself enough elapsed time to make all the various moves in rhythmical sequence. While one's sense of timing may seem a direct consequence of bodily intelligence, craft may well draw on other intellectual strengths. There is the logical ability to plot a good strategy, the capacity to recognize familiar spatial patterns and exploit them on the spot, and an interpersonal sense of the personality and motivation of other players in a game. A description of the hockey player Wayne Gretzky conveys some of these components of craft. In front of the net, eyeball to eyeball with the goalie, he will hold the puck one extra instant, upsetting the rhythm of the game and of the goalie's anticipation. Or, in the heat of play, he will release a pass before he appears ready to do so, threading it through a maze of players who are a beat behind him. If there is such a thing as sleight of body, he performed it. He sends a pass into a spot behind Goring. Nobody is there yet to receive the puck, but suddenly a teammate arrives to accept it. What seems like either luck or magic is neither. Given the probable movements of the other players, Gretzky knows exactly where his teammate is supposed to be. While some commentators might think that Gretzky's achievements were effortlessly attained, he himself disagrees. 9 out of 10 people think what I do is instinct. It isn't. Nobody would ever say a doctor had learned his profession by instinct. Yet in my own way, I've spent almost as much time studying hockey as a med student puts in studying medicine. In our culture, the professional athlete is trained much like an artistic performer and is, in fact, subjected to many of the same pressures and opportunities. Given the highly competitive environment, the achievement of excellence in athletics proves sufficiently elusive that most individuals end up as spectators. Our discussion of bodily intelligence has focused on capacities that highlight the use of the body per se, with relatively little emphasis on the use of the body, and particularly of the hands, with other materials. Yet, as we have seen, the development of the capacity to manufacture and transform objects, both directly with one's body and through the use of tools, has been especially characteristic of the human species. Work with relatively small physical objects constitutes a major part of the occupational roles of a great variety of individuals. Most workers deal with one or another kind of object, whether they are hunting, planting, farming, cooking, or toiling in a factory. Sometimes such manipulation of objects becomes routine, while at other times a considerable amount of creativity may be involved. In fact, the engineer, the technician, or the inventor does not merely use materials in culturally established ways, but actually rearranges materials in order to create an object better fitted to the task that he is confronting. We return to a question I raised earlier. Do such uses of objects and tools in general, and the devising of new inventions in particular, fall within the purview of bodily intelligence? Or are they better viewed through the lens of some other intellectual competence, or perhaps as an amalgam of several intelligences? In my view, fine motor bodily intelligence, in combination with spatial capacities, is most strongly entailed in the use of objects and tools. Particularly during the initial use of an object or a tool, the individual must carefully coordinate the information that he can assimilate through spatial intelligence with the capacities that he has elaborated through bodily intelligence. Confined to spatial intelligence, he may understand a mechanism reasonably well, yet have no idea how actually to manipulate or operate the object in which it is housed. Restricted to bodily intelligence, he may be able to execute the appropriate motions, yet fail to appreciate the way in which the apparatus or procedure works, and therefore be stymied should he encounter it in a somewhat different setting or configuration. Conceptualizing how an object should work is most likely to succeed if the individual has both a feeling for the activity of each of its parts and the capacity to envision how they will coordinate within a single mechanism. When it comes not merely to understanding complex tools or machinery, but also to the devising of new inventions, a combination of several intelligences is clearly desirable. In addition to that fusion of bodily and spatial intelligences that may suffice for understanding a common apparatus, the individual will have to use as well his logical mathematical capacities in order to figure out the precise demands of the task, the procedures that could in principle work, and the necessary and sufficient conditions for the desired product. To the extent that the individual relies on trial and error or approaches the task as an improvising handyman, or, to use Levi-Strauss's term, brickler, the use of logical mathematical reasoning will be less crucial. One can see the role of sheer deduction in invention by considering how John Arnold of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology goes about making a new kind of printing device. Rather than simply building up from printing devices that already exist, he tries to figure out the strictest set of constraints on his product. He concludes that what is basic to any printing device is that it conveys information, transfers it from one form or place to another, renders it visual, and makes multiple copies of the rendering. This analysis is pertinent whether one employs electronic means, photostatic copying, or more traditional ink-type plates and rollers. Certainly, such an approach, remote from that of the handyman, relies heavily on logical mathematical capacities. And what of the developmental links between a child's early preoccupations and eventual inventiveness in a highly valued contemporary occupation like engineering? An intriguing set of clues can be found in Tracy Kidder's account of those whiz kids who build new computer hardware. In the case of several of these talented inventors, much time during childhood was spent taking apart mechanical objects. Describing one such worker, Kidder notes, like practically everyone else on the team, he started becoming an engineer at about the age of 4, picking on ordinary household items such as lamps and clocks and radios. He took them apart whenever his parents weren't looking. This future engineer did not do well in high school or college until he took a course in basic electronics. I totally crushed, did extremely well in the course, he remembered. Another member of the computer team was very depressed in school until he discovered that he could take a telephone apart. This was a fantastic high, something I could get absorbed in and forget that I had other social problems. Such biographical accounts indicate that an interest in manipulation, in putting together or taking apart, and in the eventual reassembly of objects may play an important formative role in the development of an engineer. Such activity may also provide a needed island of reinforcement for an individual who shows scant interest or skill in other domains of experience. In our own cultural history, we must go back to Greek times to find a moment where the human body was considered beautiful, a worthy and loved and equal partner with the soul mind. In many other cultures, however, the whole area of bodily expression and knowledge continues to assume great importance. Among the Igbo peoples in Nigeria, the strong bodies needed for arduous dancing develop because all individuals travel long distances in great heat, bend to fetch water, wash in a stream, cultivate crops, squat to defecate, and carry heavy loads on the head. Already at an early age, young children begin to participate in such family chores as yam pounding, wood chopping, and transporting heavy burdens. An individual's dance practice begins in his mother's womb, then on her back as she dances. Even before he can walk, the child is encouraged to dance, and youngsters regularly practice. Among the Anang peoples in Nigeria, every individual is expected to be able to dance and sing well, to carve, and to weave. The Anang recognize that a few individuals may have talents superior to their fellows, but they firmly believe that no one lacks the requisite abilities to achieve in these aesthetic domains. As anthropologist John Messenger indicates, it is obvious that to the Anang, talent implies the possession of certain capabilities which anyone can develop if he sets out to do so. Dissemination of demanding bodily skills occurs quite widely in other societies. In Growing Up in New Guinea, Margaret Mead relates that every young Manus baby is taken out in a canoe by its mother. If a sudden wind comes, the canoe may swerve and eject mother and child into the sea. The baby has learned how to grip tight, however, and so will not be lost in the sea. By the age of 5 or 6, the child will be able to balance himself and punt the canoe with accuracy, paddle enough to steer through a mild gale, run the canoe accurately under a house without jamming the outrigger, extricate a canoe from a large group of canoes huddled closely together, and bail out a canoe by dipping the bow and stern alternately. Understanding of the sea also includes swimming, diving, proceeding underwater, and knowing how to get water out of the nose and throat. The kind of prowess that is possessed by only a tiny minority of seafaring Western children is considered within the competence of the average child in this tribal society. Bali is perhaps the most outstanding example of a society where individuals devote care to their bodies and end up as graceful, artful individuals. Everyone in this society learns to focus attention on bodily features. Learning to walk, learning the first appropriate gestures of playing musical instruments, learning to eat and to dance are all accomplished with the teacher behind the pupil, conveying directly by pressure, and almost always with a minimum of words, the gesture to be performed. Under such a system of learning, one can only learn if one is completely relaxed. The Balinese learned virtually nothing from verbal instruction. Out of this kinesthetic awareness eventually emerges a well-developed sense of balance and fine motor control. Balinese children spend a great deal of time playing with the joints of their fingers. Where an American or a New Guinea native will involve almost every muscle in his body to pick up a pin, the Balinese merely uses the muscle immediately relevant to the act, leaving the rest of the body undisturbed. The involved muscle does not draw all the others into a unified act, but smoothly and simply a few small units are moved. The fingers alone, the hand and forearm alone, or the eyes alone, as in the characteristic Balinese habit of slewing the eyes to one side without turning the head. The Balinese body flawlessly and quickly attends to the job in hand. This concern with grace can be found in other contemporary lands. For instance, in India, where awkwardness is virtually a sign of immaturity. In Japan, where the tea ceremony or flower arrangement reflect a pervasive concern with delicate form and patterning. And perhaps most fully in Zen Buddhist enclaves, where the reigning desire is to exceed the ordinary limits of one's bodily potential. Whatever the reason, the fact that a Zen master can break bricks barehand or walk on burning coals, more broadly, the master's belief that he can translate an intention directly into action, deserves to be marveled at, even if, or just because, it defies the canons of current scientific explanation. While I have considered a variety of uses to which individuals put their bodily intelligence, the focus in this chapter has been on the body as an object. We have seen how dancers and athletes use their entire bodies as mere objects, and noted how inventors and other workers use parts of the body, particularly the hands, in order to manipulate, arrange, and transform objects in the world. Described in this vein, bodily intelligence completes a trio of object-related intelligences. Logical mathematical intelligence, which grows out of the patterning of objects into numerical arrays. Spatial intelligence, which focuses on the individual's ability to transform objects within his environment and to make his way amidst a world of objects in space. And bodily intelligence, which, focusing inward, is limited to the exercise of one's own body. And facing outward entails physical actions on the objects in the world. But the body is more than simply another machine, indistinguishable from the artificial objects of the world. It is also the vessel of the individual's sense of self, his most personal feelings and aspirations, as well as that entity to which others respond in a special way because of their uniquely human qualities. From the very first, an individual's existence as a human being affects the way that others will treat him. And very soon, the individual comes to think of his own body as special. He comes to form a sense of self that he will perpetually modify, and that will in turn come to influence his thoughts and behavior as he comes to respond to others in his environment in terms of their special traits and behavior. While still poorly understood, the realm of the personal intelligences is clearly of utmost importance to humans. The site of our most awesome accomplishments as well as of our most terrifying tendencies. To this Janus-headed variety of intelligence, partly mired within the inner emotional affective sphere, partly peering outward to the circle of other people, we must now shift our gaze. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find Gardner's book summary and many other fundamental persuasion books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychologic and marketing content. See you in the next one.